Today, there is a lot of research going on regarding consciousness, where it exists, how it happens, and so on. Scientists and experts are talking about it extensively in mainstream media and on social media as well. I am currently writing a book about consciousness based on the Abhidhamma, the Buddha's deepest science, to provide clues and evidence for our modern scientists and researchers to make their work easier. Because I'm interested in consciousness, I also watch modern findings and experts' discussions to see what they are discovering. But the issue is modern science is based on materialism. My purpose here, I suppose, bridging the gap between this material-based science and ultimate reality. Recently, I watched a discussion led by Professor Brian Cox, Àlex Gómez-Marín, and few others. Few are getting closer, but many are nowhere near. There are so many points in it that I need to address, and not just regarding Brian Cox. So may this video be beneficial to all. Before I go into the discussion, I'd like to play a short clip of Brian Cox. And after I play a few clips, there is a comprehensive explanation about consciousness, including the definition, evidences, cognitive processing paths. I think you do not want to miss. So let's see this short.
We don't know what consciousness is, right? So it's often called a hard problem in science. Let's say you want to build a self-replicating machine, something that can go and maybe go to the moon or Mars and replicate itself and then carry on, which is a living thing, I suppose.
Yes.
Does it have to have a sufficient level of intelligence that it actually is conscious? And all these things that we talked about, this word meaning, we all understand, but can't define. Is that a emergent property that has to emerge if you've got something that's intelligent enough to replicate itself and live and, as you said, be the... I don't know the answer, but it's worth considering that this thing, emotion, meaning, love and fear and all those things are just the things that happen when you are intelligent.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that, but it could possibly be.
The good thing is that he accepted that he has no idea what consciousness is. Just to be clear, I'm not putting anyone down, I'm not mocking them, and I'm not against science. What I simply want to do is share this message with Professor Brian Cox, with other scientists and experts who are discussing consciousness, and also with you watching this video who are highly interested in knowing what consciousness really is. So I urge you to rethink some parts of modern consciousness research are moving in the wrong direction, mainly because of the starting assumptions and materialism. So as an example, I want to take a recent video recorded by the BBC Studios Science Unit featuring 3 scientists and a podcaster led by Professor Brian Cox. I want to play a few cuts of that video and highlight where I think the research directions may be misguided. Again, I support this research effort. I actually want to help whoever needs it. My goal is to support consciousness researchers in the right direction by pointing out hidden aspects of consciousness to the Western scientific world, by offering a clearer definition of consciousness, and by sharing the very important cognitive processing paths of consciousness and how consciousness processes data, whether it processes in parallel or serial when your body is in contact with the environment at all times. If anyone would like my assistance to support their researches, I'm happy to help. My contact details are available in my channel description. So let's continue to Professor Brian Cox.
Of Science recorded here at the Francis Crick Institute in London. This is the podcast where a panel of experts tackle your questions on some of the biggest scientific challenges facing society today. We'll be asking the world's top scientists your questions about issues that are central to all our lives. Can we cure cancer? Can we live longer? Should we fear AI? This episode for me is about a subject that I think is one of the most interesting topics in all of science, consciousness. Despite great advances in neuroscience, psychology, and computational modeling, we are nowhere near, I think it's fair to say, having a theory that explains how our experience emerges from physical processes in the brain.
This is where it starts to mislead everyone. The assumption. You have already assumed that consciousness is something that happens via physical processes in the brain. The brain supports the functionality of the body and it assists consciousness, but it has nothing to do with the origin of consciousness. I will tell you why at the end. It is difficult to find the beginning of the lineage of consciousness because it is endless. It goes back to the beginningless time. It is the same with this universe. It is expanding and contracting. It goes like a cycle. It is never the case that the universe began in just one big bang out of nowhere. How absurd is it to think that way? And let's continue with the panel.
So today we're going to fix that. Are we going to, looking at the panel? As we will be asking, what is consciousness? What processes give rise to our subjective experiences? Where might consciousness be located? How does it arise? And what are some of the most convincing explanations for it? To answer those questions, I'm joined by 4 experts involved in the latest discoveries and theories of consciousness. And they are.
I'm Anil Seth. I'm from the University of Sussex. In my research group, we have mathematicians and psychologists and neuroscientists and computer scientists all trying to bash our heads against this question of what is consciousness and how does it happen for many years now.
I'm Katharina Schmack. I'm a group leader here at the Francis Crick Institute. We study consciousness through the lens of psychosis, and in particular, we are interested in how the brain and the body give rise to hallucinations.
I'm Steve Fleming. I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College London, just down the road from here. I run a brain imaging lab studying metacognition and how we think about our own thinking. And I'm also involved in developing cognitive neuroscience theories of consciousness.
I'm Alex O'Connor. I'm not a scientist. I'm interested, though, in how scientific findings can inform philosophical theorizing. I'm the host of the Within Reason podcast, which is a philosophy podcast, but I'm always speaking with scientists and attempting a kind of cross-disciplinary approach.
And this is our panel.
If you listen closely, they are all trying to touch consciousness through various different fields, from brain studies, neuroscience, psychology, and psychosis, to mathematics and computer science. In Sri Lanka, where there are a lot of elephants, there's a famous parable of the blind man and the elephant. It is an ancient story teaching that our limited perspectives only show part of a larger truth, leading to disputes when we mistake our partial view for the whole. Each blind man touches a different part of the elephant, the trunk, leg, ear, tusk, belly, tail, and describes the elephant as a snake, a pillar, a fan, a spear, a wall, or a rope. This leads to arguments until someone explains they are all partially right. So what I'm trying to say, and I hope you already predicted this, is that by touching neuroscience, brain functions, psychosis, mathematics, and computer science, their understanding is not even partial. It is extremely limited. They cannot know the whole of consciousness this way. I am also very interested in following where this new research is heading. And I often ask myself, are they anywhere close to that deep level of what the Buddha analyzed and explained in Abhidhamma, where consciousness is analyzed to its deepest core in such a descriptive and detailed way? And what is even more beautiful about it is that you can conduct the provided experiments and observe it and experience it yourself. You wouldn't imagine this, but there is no one currently in the world today, and there is probably never will be, like the Buddha, who analyzed consciousness to the ultimate possible reality, down to the absolute tiniest bit. And provided such an enormous amount of accurate detail. If someone were to physically print the volumes of what the Buddha taught about consciousness, a room wouldn't be big enough to hold them. I would say it is an encyclopedia of the mind and consciousness. And I genuinely believe every scholar and researcher of consciousness should read these teachings first. But unfortunately, English translations are very scarce. That is one reason I'm putting this effort to bring this to Western society and the Western school of science. This analysis of consciousness is documented in the Abhidhamma, one of the Tripitaka under the volume of Dhammasangani, the enumeration of phenomena. Now, you know that when you conduct research in the Western school of thought, you have to make assumptions and then you form hypotheses. So the theory you derive is based on these conditions and these assumptions. As someone who follows modern consciousness research by watching world pioneers speak about it, I notice that most of them start with the assumption that consciousness is something located in the brain. And I keep thinking, why do they make that assumption every time? Because if your assumptions are wrong, the whole research project can become fruitless, or at the very least, it gets limited. To be fair, at the very least, they should have considered interest in evidence. For example, patients who underwent heart surgeries later experienced personality changes. And that is one obvious empirical clue that challenges the default assumption. That kind of observation should lead to a better question. And let's see the consciousness video introduction.
I thought we'd begin with a definition. What do we mean by consciousness?
I go back to a philosopher, Thomas Nagel, 50 years ago, who gave, I think, a beautifully minimal definition of consciousness. It says, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be me, feels like something to be you, but it doesn't feel like anything, we think, to be a table or a chair.
Did you hear that? Anencephaly brings a definition from a philosopher. For a consciousness organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. You see? Something. Aha. Okay, let's move to the next.
For me, consciousness is simply the state of being aware and having subjective experiences of the world.
Steve?
I agree with that. And I think it's also important to contrast what we mean by being conscious of something against all the other kinds of brain processes that we think are going on unconsciously.
Àlex?
I agree with Thomas Nagel's definition, with an emphasis on the subjectivity, which is why I think it's such a difficult question for science, which is in the domain of objectivity.
So, complete agreement. Thank you for listening. Thank you. So, there's a wonderfully brief definition.
Okay, he complimented the wonderfully brief definition. So, if we revisit what they said about consciousness briefly, an agreement that consciousness is something it is like to be, a state of being aware, having subjective experience, or being conscious of something against brain activities we think go on unconsciously. To me, even these brief definitions sound remarkably childish for a scientist. Scientific definition has requirements to be a definition like observable, measurable, and repeatable sort of things. But we already know the reason because they conduct experiments based on their own assumptions. Once again, it sounds like blind people trying to describe an elephant. Likewise, there are so many definitions of consciousness. In the modern world, the hard problem of consciousness remains the most elusive mystery for scientists and philosophers. But there are some scientists, they understand the framework they were fed since childhood and getting closer to the ultimate reality. I really appreciate this scientist, at least his understanding, and he seems open to look at many aspects. And let's watch these small parts I gathered.
So I would say the evidence suggests that the mind can survive the activity of the brain. And when brains are broken or shut off, there can still be mind going on. And that's revolutionary.
Why do you believe that?
I don't know what the ultimate nature of reality is, but what I try to first assess is whether the stories that they've told us about it are right, or maybe whether there are other alternatives. That's why I've been a fierce critic of materialism, because as a scientist, started 400 years ago, and Galileo made that split. I call it the foundational wound. It was a great business move. He said, let's start doing science on that portion of reality that lends itself more easily to mathematization and measurement. So for some reason, like, you know, the solidity of this table or the movement of planets lend themselves very well to this foundational idea of science. But as time went on, 400 years later, we realized that we had forgotten the other side, which is what really matters. What really matters is pain, is love, is feeling, sensation, consciousness, which is very hard to define, but very intimate. We all know what it is. It's that thing that disappears when we go into deep sleep and comes back in the morning. It's what it is like to be, as Nagel said, is the feeling of being alive. So materialism is good to study certain things, but then when it ossifies into this ideology and then is dressed like science, now it's preventing us from understanding these key questions that are... We could speak about different things. We could talk about physics or about neuroscience. I happen to have training on both. These are kind of my two legs. But very interestingly, for instance, for neuroscientists, 99% of them, I'm not included in that portion, believe that the brain can only be a productive organ. It's an organ that somehow, somewhere, consciousness emerges. It's like a lamp, and then something happens, magic happens, and then consciousness emerges. That's the position you need to be if you're a materialist, because if the only really real thing is matter, then you need to say, well, just give us some more time and money, and we'll figure out how mind emerges or is produced from matter. And there are many philosophically sophisticated ways of criticizing this. Now there's another option, which is the brain as a permissive organ. This was said by William James more than 100 years ago. Now then the brain wouldn't be like this machine, like this, for instance, heat engine whose smoke is consciousness, which is what we would have in the first big model, the productive model. But in the permissive model, the brain would be a kind of a filter. And so what the brain would still have a very important role in consciousness, but it wouldn't be a productive role. It would be a permissive, much like a filter or much like a prism would receive light, and I'm speaking metaphorically, would receive the light of the mind, and then it could reflect it and refract it. And so the prism is not creating the light or the colors, it's just letting them go through. Now, with these two big options on the table, I think we can make progress into what I call the edges of consciousness, which are all these experiences, weird experiences that many people have, but we don't tell them to each other, and pieces of data that point in one direction or another. So I would say the evidence suggests that the mind can survive the activity of the brain, that when brains are broken or shut off, there can still be mind going on. And that's revolutionary. That would entail that when we die, it's not game over, which, by the way, is the thesis of materialism. I have this phrase, if consciousness survives, materialism dies. It's game over for materialism if something of us continues after we die.
So you think there is mental continuity after death?
Well, I think so, and I believe so, and I could also say I may have experienced it myself, because really hard question of survival. For instance, there are children who remember previous lives. This was studied by Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia for more than 50 years. It's an amazing research. He went all over the world and collected all these case studies, all these stories, in plural. These were data of kids, very young age, who would describe up to 40 items that then he could go and verify. There wasn't internet. There was really no way the kid could know, or why would the kid say that when I was living in this other body and I was a woman and that's where I am, that's how my house would look like, or that's how I would die, right? Again, there is evidence, not proof, but there's evidence not only that something weird and interesting is happening as we cross the threshold, but also when we come back to this life. So scientists should not be afraid of studying this, but they are, because there's stigma. There's usually stigma upon the enigma, and this is so unfortunate. And one of the reasons is because of the ideology of materialism, because those things cannot be possible.
I want to express my sincere gratitude to Àlex Gómez-Marín. It takes immense courage for a modern physicist and neuroscientist to stand up against the rigid dogmas of materialism and admit that science has been missing half the picture for 400 years. And he's doing exactly what true science should do. He's following the data even when it leads to uncomfortable truths like near-death experiences, rather than blindly following the ideology of the establishment. And some, like Christoph Koch, argue that consciousness is simply the feeling of life itself, a byproduct of complex brain processing. Others, like Sir Roger Penrose, look to the quantum collapse of wave functions in microtubules within our cells, searching for a physical mechanism in the weirdness of quantum physics to explain the weirdness of the mind. We even hear theories of panpsychism, suggesting that consciousness might be a fundamental force like gravity, pervading all matter from rocks to thermostats. While these experts circle around consciousness, they often hit a wall. They treat consciousness either as a mystical fluid filling the universe or as a static thing or process produced by the brain. And these definitions lack so many things required to complete a full definition of consciousness. And there are certain requirements you need to fulfill to make it a definition. It needs to be observable, measurable, repeatable, clear, and precise. So, before I provide you with this definition, which is totally new for many of you, or perhaps you may be thinking in a different direction towards what consciousness is, I would like to play this small clip from Mikhail Devrot, who won the Nobel Prize for quantum tunneling in 2025. He explains that when you are learning new or totally weird subjects or concepts, you have to be patient and embrace them. So let's listen to what he says for a minute.
I think sometimes for many of us, physics can feel a bit baffling, maybe sometimes counterintuitive. I wonder if you need a degree of just acceptance about the laws of physics to be able to think further and to succeed.
I think what I would say is that when you learn these subjects, you have to have a certain amount of patience. So if you try to understand everything right away, you can be very frustrated. So I think that you have to embrace these concepts that seem very weird at the beginning, but year after year, you learn them more.
So what I'm going to tell you to get my message across to the scientists and experts of today's world regarding consciousness could be totally new for many of you, and at certain points may sound very weird, but do your own research. Apply your own consciousness to what I'm going to say from this point onward. These concepts were taught by Buddha and in the world's oldest university. Do you know what is the world's oldest university? It was Nalanda University, established in 5th century BC in India, just after the Buddha's parinirvana, the passing away, and residential to 10,000 students those days, and with the largest library. It was mentioned that those days millions of people have realized this ultimate truth of consciousness, life and matter, and then they never had to face any sad moments and were always happy. It is the thing that we all wanted, to be happy. Buddha has already analyzed and given us a complete definition and comprehensive volumes of details regarding consciousness. This definition satisfies the requirements of what a definition must be, even per modern science. And it is the most advanced, observable, measurable, and repeatable explanation of consciousness. scientifically verifiable explanation that you can experiment with and experience yourself within this life. Consciousness or chitta or the mind is not a thing. Most of the time, when they cannot understand this consciousness properly, people are trying to apply this concept called soul. You can call and label whatever the name you like, but it is not a static thing or a soul, nor a spirit, nor a static entity residing in your head or brain. It is a stream of actions that happen so fast that within the blink of an eye, quadrillions upon billions of consciousness occur. One of these moments is called mind moment or consciousness moment. In Pali, a consciousness moment is called chittakshana. Once you keep analyzing consciousness to its absolute base, Buddha has explained in Abhidhamma that this reality is one of the ultimate truths among the 4 categories of ultimate realities. This is important. Now, I'm going to give the definition of consciousness. As a summary of what I understood from Abhidhamma, the most precise definition I can give to consciousness, and I have to do this in a few sentences. Consciousness is the act of cognizing objects. It occurs not as a static entity, but as a beginningless, rapid, discrete stream of mind moments called chittakshana, forming a lineage of consciousness or chitta parampara that arise and cease without interval, dependent on the 5 sense bases and the heart base. It is a conditioned phenomena that arises solely through the collision of a sense faculty and a sense object or energy such as light or sound or matter such as smell or taste, propelled by the momentum of preceding consciousness. It is an absolute reality that performs the function of knowing without a knower, rising and vanishing instantly in a ceaseless stream. And it can be observed through an observation process. So that's the best brief definition I could give you for consciousness. What I mean as objects here is some refer as substance like table, yourself, earth, mass, sun, and subtle materials like taste, smell, and vibrations and thoughts, anything that the senses can detect. And every thought, feelings, sensations, pain, and love you have, all derived based on consciousness due to the collisions of objects. Every being has a limited range of cognizing these objects. For example, you can only see certain range of visible frequencies, sounds, touch, vibrations, smells, and tastes. And different animals have their own kinds of ranges, like horses and dogs. And modern experts often try to find the origin of consciousness in the brain or via evolution. The Abhidhamma refutes this with powerful logic. Consciousness has no beginning. I know that in order to understand this, you need to study deep into it. It cannot be explained simply in one go. You need to study the reality of the evolution of humans and the cosmos to understand that consciousness has no beginning. However, there are interesting evidences. At the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, conducted researches of anecdotal reports and cases of people, particularly young children, who speak about detailed memories of what they claim are past lives. Just as mango fruits arise only in a lineage of mango trees and nowhere else, thoughts arise strictly within a stream of consciousness. And if you try to find the first mango tree, you will exhaust yourself. Similarly, consciousness is a lineage called parampara. A thought can only be born from a preceding thought and has a connection to the past, like a memory. It cannot be created by a biological accident, or God, or Brahma, or anyone. Surprisingly though, a thought cannot stand alone, just as a weak person needs a walking stick to stand. Every single consciousness needs an object to arise and one of the 54 mental factors. Now, I'm going to address the very hard problem of where consciousness occurs in the body. This is a crucial addition as it directly challenges modern neuroscience using embryology. Modern science states the consciousness is generated by the brain. However, the Abhidhamma argues that the mind exists before the brain is formed. Modern science is a field in a state of continuous evolution. Science does not mean they have discovered everything in the world. It simply means they are in the process of discovering it, but very slow. Even though it appears to be advancing rapidly, there are vast realities that science has not yet touched. And historically, we know that many facts once held as scientific truth were later proven wrong. Why does this happen? Because Western science depends entirely on external instruments, microscope, sensors, and scanners. It is limited by the resolution of its tools. As some of you may have heard, scientists recently discovered a bright flash of light that occurs at the exact moment of conception when a sperm fertilizes an egg, and it is visible only with special microscope. At first, they were surprised. Then they offered a material explanation. They called it a zinc spark. They see the spark, but they miss the fire. In a few years, I believe this purely material reasoning will be seen as incomplete. There are 4 types of starts to life described by the Buddha. In a womb, in an egg, moisture-dependent like bacteria and microorganisms, and spontaneous. In humans, for a successful conception to occur, as the Buddha explained, 3 things must be present. The genetic matter from the father, sperm, the genetic matter from the mother, an egg, and the starting of consciousness. Science is still trying to find when the consciousness starts. Your real birthday is not the day you came out of the womb. It is the day the conception started. Think about it logically. Can we call a sperm a life or a being on its own? No. Can we call an unfertilized egg a being? No. Even if the sperm enters the egg, if no consciousness arises there, can we call it a being? No. It would just be 2 biological matter that fails to develop. To be a being, it requires a mind. We know that your genes come from your mother and your father, but where do you think your consciousness comes from? Does it come from your mother or does it come from your father? If your consciousness were merely a biological product inherited from your parents in your brain, like your eye color or height, then your personality, your fears, and your thinking spectrum should be identical to theirs, but they are not. You are a unique individual with your own mind, with distinct mental thumbprint. So conception is a combination of matter from parents and mind from the lineage of consciousness. Modern science is currently debating whether an embryo has consciousness, and there is no consensus yet. Why? Because they lack the necessary instruments to detect the rebirth link in consciousness. They can measure the zinc spark, which is the physical echo, but they cannot yet measure the energy of the consciousness that caused it. Someone might misunderstand that this consciousness is the same as when it arose at the start of conception, but it is not. Consciousness also has a lifespan, and this lifespan is very, very small, probably the smallest unit of time in the universe, and is homogeneous amongst everyone and every being. Consciousness has 3 stages in its lifespan: the arising, the existing moment, and the perishing. Because of the tiniest nature of time of these moments, they are called moment or shan. And these 3 stages together are called mind moment or chittakshan. I also explained about this time unit in my previous videos. So the lifespan of the mind is one mind moment. To give you an idea about how small this mind moment is, there are multi-quadrillions and billions of mind moments that happens within the time it takes to blink an eye. So nothing could beat this speed, not even light. If the consciousness leaves before giving birth, the embryo or the human dies inside the womb. Sometimes there are babies born without a brain, yet they were alive inside the womb. In medical terminology, this is called Anencephaly, a severe birth defect leading to death shortly after birth or even stillbirth. This means they can be alive in the womb for a time but without a brain, or lack the necessary brain structure for life, which means if it doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have consciousness. That is why I said it is a wrong assumption to make that consciousness is something or a process inside the brain. It takes approximately 14 weeks for the brain to form and become functional. So if consciousness is something in the brain, where does it live during those first 14 weeks before the brain exists? The brain is merely an organ for maintaining the body's machinery like breathing, digestion, temperature, and assisting the sensitive organs like eyes, ears, and perhaps acting as a messenger for consciousness. But it is not the seat of consciousness itself. Also, you may have heard stories that people are still alive even after their brain is damaged by an accident because their heart is still working with the aid of machines. But as soon as the heart stopped or removes aids for heart to run, then the consciousness cannot be maintained there. You may have heard of evidence that people who underwent heart surgeries ended up having a changed personality. Evidence for personality changes after heart transplants include anecdotal reports and studies showing shifts in preferences like food, music, art, and emotions like increased assertiveness or euphoria, depression, and even experiencing donor memories or skills. There again is a wrong assumption by scientists. They say that organ cellular memory or hormonal shifts or psychological factors like guilt or adaptation. There is lack of scientific consensus. I request you to take these heart transplanted patients' evidence as a lead and consider in your researches, please. It is a very hard thing to unlearn things you have learned because in conventional terms, your consciousness has a lineage to previous occurrences. What it called in general terms is you are brainwashed with frames you were familiar before, and it clings strongly to that framework. So let's see how the consciousness works. Probably you may be wondering how can we perceive things simultaneously? Like, for example, when you are watching this video, you can see the video and hear the sound at the same time. How come? Is it possible? When a person possessing healthy faculties such as eyes, ears, nose, etc., and endowed with good mindfulness stands in a certain place, forms, sounds, smell, tastes, tangibles, and such objects existing in him and around him are encountered by that person according to the occasion. At that time, what he feels is that seeing those forms and hearing sounds, smelling smells, tasting tastes, feeling touch, thinking other things, moving the body and speaking, all these various things are happening simultaneously. However, consciousness takes only one object or thought at a time, because multitude of consciousness arise and cease separately, taking objects or thoughts as objects within an extremely short time. As I said, quadrillions of trillions of mind moments within a blink of an eye, so you feel as if it happens at once. It is difficult to demonstrate this even with an analogy, but a mere example I can tell you is that when you are watching a movie or this video, I have set the frame rate to 24 frames per second. This means I'm showing you 24 still images per second, so you feel like this is a continuous flow, but it is not. The Abhidhamma teaches that the world is composed of 4 types of ultimate realities: consciousness, mental factors, corp reality called rupa, and enlightenment, nirvana. Among these, consciousness or chitta is the chief or the king because it is the creator of your world, the fundamental awareness of an object and thoughts. Conventional language created by this illusional consciousness traps us. We say, I see the flower. This implies there is an I, a stable self, and a flower, a stable object. And some people, because they have lack of understanding to this consciousness, they theorize that there is a soul within the body or outside. However, Abhidhamma reveals that seeing is actually a specific type of consciousness called chakku vijnana that arises solely due to the collision of an image or of an object called rupa with the eye sensitivity called chakku pasada, which is retina. What really happens is when the conditions are satisfied, that means the light, object, and a healthy eye sensitivity, the event of seeing occurs. When the light is there, and the light is also made up of fundamental energy bundles, the flower or the object absorbs certain energies and reflects certain energies. And these small units of energy bundles, which we call the spectrum of light, collide or contact with the retina of the eye. I will explain the process briefly a bit later about how consciousness arises in the eye. So what I wanted to tell you is that there is no seer behind the eye. There are only the rapid actions of a seeing consciousness. It arises, performs the function of seeing, and instantly perishes. As the Abhidhamma states, the consciousness which recognizes and sees other things does not know its own nature. Consciousness cannot see itself. We can only be aware that we were conscious a split second ago. What we call mind is actually a rapid succession of discrete actions of events happening in a single path as a continuous line of actions or a series. Because it happens so fast, it creates the illusion of the world like a movie. Much like a firebrand spun in a circle creates the illusion of a ring of fire. Modern experts struggle to explain how the brain generates feelings. They ask, how do potassium chloride ions sloshing in the brain turns into a feeling of toothache or pain? The deep science of Buddha's teaching resolves this by removing the mystery of emergence and replacing it with a causality or called pachaya. Consciousness does not arise from nothing. It occurs or is actioned through a specific set of conditions. For a consciousness to generate, a specific set of components must collide or in contact with. The Abhidhamma identifies 6 doors through which consciousness arises. So these are eye door, when colors or shapes sort of eye detectable range of waves impact the eye sensitivity. And the ear door, when sounds range human ear can grasp, impact the ear sensitivity. And nose door, when odors means sort of subtle forms of matter, impact the nose sensitivity. And the tongue door, when tastes, sort of subtle forms of matter, impact the buds on the tongue. And the body door, when tangibles and body detecting range of energies and vibrations such as hot, cold, hard, soft impact the body sensitivity. And the mind door, when previous thoughts created by the lineage of consciousness, ideas, memories, or concepts impact the consciousness itself. And there's a universal rule. No knowing is possible without the connection with something to be known. Just as a drum produces sounds only when struck, and consciousness generates only when there is a preceding consciousness, which is always there. And an object called Aramana strikes a sensory base consciousness. When consciousness arises on the sensory base, it is called Vijnana. If you are in a pitch black room, eye consciousness cannot generate because the condition of form or light is missing. If you are fully deaf, ear consciousness cannot generate because the condition of ear sensitivity is broken. This dispels the modern notion that consciousness is a field like gravity or universal consciousness. Gravity exists whether you interact with it or not. Consciousness, however, requires a preceding consciousness and an active collision to act. It is an action, an event, or we can even call it a process, but not a thing. Why do we feel like one continuous person? Imagine a river. It looks like a single solid object, but if you analyze it, it is just billions of water droplets flowing together. Similarly, your mind is like a current, a lineage of consciousness called Bhavanga Santati. When one consciousness dies, it transfers its energy to the next one instantly, with no gap. The consciousness when in sleep or when there are no objects to take on is called Bhavanga Chitta. And this is the life continuum consciousness. It is the resting state of the mind, like a car engine idling, that maintains your existence between active thoughts. So that means the consciousness is still actioning at the same speed, but it currently takes no subtle objects. When an object strikes a sense door, the consciousness in the Bhavanga mode is vibrated and active consciousness cognitive process flow begins. Also, there are specific paths for the cognitive processes. This needs to be discussed in a broad manner because they are very complex cognitive process paths depending on various aspects and scenarios. So, however, complete cognitive process paths are described in Abhidhamma. But to give you an idea of a blueprint today, and this is where the Abhidhamma becomes the quantum chemistry of the mind, while modern science looks at brain scans or blobs of brain activity. Abhidhamma has maps of consciousness cognitive process flow called Chitta Veethi, the sequence of consciousness required to process a single signal. At a given moment, your mind is in a resting state of Bhavanga, the life continuum consciousness. When you see an object, your cognitive process starts with the rising, existing, and perishing of 17 consciousness moments, actioning in a serial path or lightning fast sequence of 17 mind moments. Just for the purpose of cognitive path explanation, assume a certain man, having covered his head, is sleeping at the foot of a fruit-bearing mango tree when a ripe mango loosens from the stalk and falls near him. Awakened by the sound of the mango falling, he uncovers his head and looks, sees the mango fruit, picks it up with his hand, squeezes it with his fingers to check if it is ripe, determines that it is indeed ripe by smelling it at his nose, eats it, experiencing the taste, and swallows the mango pulp along with the saliva remaining in the throat, and then goes back to sleep just as before. In this analogy, the mango tree bearing fruit should be known as the sense sphere wholesome existence, the human world. The man should be known as the consciousness of sense sphere being. So let's look at the basic cognitive process flow. Just for the explanation, first let's consider the consciousness is in its idle state. The state of man is asleep should be known as the life continuum Bhavanga. The hearing of the falling object should be known as the vibrating or shaking life continuum consciousness, which is the encountering of the object. Then our man waking up shall be considered as the rest or striking life continuum. At the fourth, then the man looking at where he heard the sound should be known as the five-door adverting consciousness. The fifth stage of the process flow, the scene of the fallen object by the man, should be known as the eye consciousness or chakku viññāna, or the consciousness arising in the eye's retina. This is where I said that the heart base is not the only place consciousness arises. Consciousness arises in the five sense doors as well. At number 6, taking it by the hand should be known as the accepting or receiving consciousness. We call it Sampadiccana Citta. Then at number 7, squeezing and checking to see that it is a mango should be known as the investigating consciousness, or called Santirana Citta. On the 8th step, determining that it is ripe by smelling should be known as the determining consciousness, called Vattappana Citta. From number 9 to 15 steps, there are 7 steps. Eating the mango should be known as the impulsion consciousness, or called Javana Citta. So the man takes about 7 bites of the mango. Don't ask me why 7. It is the natural law of cognitive paths of consciousness. Then number 16 to 17, man swallowing the pulp remaining in the throat should be known as the registration of the identified object. We called it Tadaramana. Then the man going back to sleep should be known as the descent into life continuum or Bhavanga Patha. This is just a simple example I thought would be good. This is just a simple cognitive process path of your consciousness. How you get to know things. However, it says for a very mindful person to cognize or to be aware that he has seen an object, about 36 of these cognitive process paths or Chitta Veethi needs to happen. Because cognitive processing needs to run for several cycles to make it powerful enough to be aware of or cognize. So this process path of cognition or Chitta Veethi explains how the consciousness operates in a sequential, lawful, natural order when an object is presented to it. It is not a random occurrence but a fixed series of mental events. There are so many consciousness cognitive processes that needs to be descriptively discussed and explained, such as the ear consciousness process path, the nose consciousness process path, slight object cognitive process, mind or cognitive processes, clear object cognitive processes, and obscure object cognitive processes, and so many more. Buddha has categorized consciousness such that any consciousness you have belong to one of those categories. This consciousness, designated as the ultimate reality of consciousness or lineage of Chitta Parampara, comprises 89 types in brief and 121 types in detail. As per Abhidhamma, the consciousness arises at the exact moment of conception, not earlier or not later. The first consciousness, called Patisandhi Citta, which means the rebirth link in consciousness, arises at the very moment of conception. I have described briefly in a previous video that fundamental unit of matter is a fundamental energy bundle or Rupa Kalapa, smaller than quarks, similar to string, smallest unit of matter. At that exact moment, the reconnecting consciousness arises. The embryo creates At that exact moment, the reconnecting consciousness arises in the embryo, creates a specific kind of matter form called Vattarupa, or the base decade fundamental energy bundle. It is made up of 10 fundamental energy bundles. I have explained these FABs in one of my previous videos, so you can watch after this to get a better idea. So this reconnecting consciousness arises at the exact moment of conception, not a moment before, not later, and it arises dependent on that decade energy bundle called Vattarupa. This is the smallest unit of matter. It is an energy string. However, even though this consciousness is dependent on the Vattarupa, it is disassociated from it. There is no single word for that in English, but in Pali this is called vipayutta, which means consciousness is disassociated from the Vattu decade energy bundle but dependent around it. Later, the formation of the heart develops around this Vattu decade bundle. Thus, consciousness is mainly dependent on yet disassociated from the heart base around this Vattu decade FEB. Here I said mainly because this consciousness is entangled with 5 other sensory bases. Even though consciousness arises, exists, and perishes without leaving anything behind, it has a relationship or connection called the lineage of consciousness. So the consciousness that arises in the embryo has a lineage of consciousness connecting to the previous existence. But the start of the consciousness cannot be found, and it runs to an infinite length of time. In this life, your lineage of consciousness started at the time of conception. The end of the lineage of consciousness of this life is the last consciousness occurring at the time of death. It's called the Chuthi consciousness. It doesn't mean that it is the end of consciousness itself. In between, an enormous amount of consciousness happens. They ask big questions, but here is one they missed. Consciousness arises and perishes faster than the speed of light. When the Chuthi consciousness means the last consciousness of a dying being perishes from that life, then it arises in another subtle place in one of the 4 methods I told earlier. In a womb, in an egg, around moisture-like amoeba, or spontaneous. It could be in this world or somewhere far across galaxy, and in the next mind moment, leaving no gap before the next consciousness. It quite similar to quantum entanglement. It happens in the next moment, 1 quadrillionth of a billionth of a second. So it is definitely faster than light. So any living being, including animals in this world, galaxy, or the universe, their consciousness belongs to one of those 89 types. All these 89 consciousness or thoughts are divided based on the plane of existence, based on nature, wholesome or unwholesome, based on pleasure, neutral or displeasure consciousness, and then mundane or supramundane. There's no time to discuss that today. It has to be for another video. Before I conclude this session today, I hope that this answers the big last question everyone is trying to predict an answer to. Can machinery or artificial intelligence be conscious? The answer is no. Unless you make the artificial intelligence like a biological substance with a specific form of matter. With that, you create the environment where a consciousness can arise and continue the lineage of consciousness, based on and dependent on, but disassociated with it, whatever you create. If the conditions are satisfied, then if a consciousness would arise, in other words, you create another living being, and that would be out of your control, just like a clone. I think there you must consider ethics and universal rules. If you are going against the ethics of natural law, then you better shall be ready to face the consequences as well. Also, in my next videos, I will talk more about the cognitive processing paths, consciousness types, sleeps and dreams, how consciousness works at birth and death, how consciousness works in other beings and the universe, and what experimental methods Buddha has provided in Abhidhamma. When we say death, many are afraid, but dying is an ultimate lie we were fed with. The real death is the death of consciousness, and it is what it is called nibbana or nirvana or the enlightenment. This consciousness is the reason for all the chaos and sufferings. There is a path to end it. So stay tuned. Modern experts are stuck waiting for a final theory of consciousness. They use third-person observations like machines, instruments, scans, and measurements. The Buddha's method is first-person observation. by understanding that consciousness is discrete events without intervals, momentary actions generated by the collision of senses and objects, you can start the ultimate experiment, which I will tell you how to do in a later video. So you yourself can observe how the consciousness works. I hope you now have better understood what consciousness is, that it runs to infinite time, basics of how consciousness works and its cognitive process flows, etc. This definition removes the self from the equation and leaves only the stream of actions of consciousness with a lineage. No matter how many school of thoughts you are trying to be, inclusive of like scientific, philosophical, panpsychism, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, religion, psychology, whatever side you want to hold, this is the ultimate reality. The trillions of flickers that make up the illusion of you. Thank you. See you next time.